Okay, so for anyone out there trying to keep up with all the important stuff happening every day, especially if you've got the UPSC exams on your mind, it's like you're always trying to connect the dots between these like random news stories.
Yeah, it can feel pretty overwhelming sometimes, right? Trying to figure out the bigger picture behind everything.
Totally. And that's actually what we're all about here. Doing these deep dives,
Yeah.
taking like one specific news item and like really digging into it.
Exactly. Like today, we're going to be looking at this piece from the Hindu about these habitual offender laws. And like you said, it's not just about knowing the facts, it's about understanding the context and what it all means, for Indian society, for the way we govern ourselves.
Right. Because, I mean, you see a term like that, habitual offender laws, and you might just kind of skim over it. But
Yeah, but the thing is, like, for anyone preparing for the UPSC, this kind of topic could pop up anywhere, right? In the mains exam, maybe even the prelims.
oh, for sure. So we're going to break it all down for you. Explain what these laws are all about, why they're causing so much debate, and like what it all says about our legal system and how we view things like justice and equality.
Exactly. So let's get right into it. What exactly are these habitual offender laws anyway?
Yeah, like what's the deal with that?
Well, in the simplest terms, they're basically legal tools that states can use to kind of single out and keep an eye on people who have been convicted of certain crimes multiple times.
So like if you get caught doing something wrong over and over again, they put you in this special category.
Right. And the idea, they say, is to monitor these individuals and maybe even prevent future crimes because, they've shown a pattern of behavior.
Okay, I get it.
Yeah.
So it's not just some old law that's faded away. The Hindu article made it clear that this is still very much a thing in many parts of India.
Oh, yeah. It's definitely still active. According to what the government told Parliament just recently, these laws are still in effect in 14 states and union territories.
Wow, so this is widespread. That's pretty significant.
It is, and that's why it's so important to understand the whole picture. And to
Yeah.
do that, you really have to look back at where these laws came from. It's not like this is something new.
Right. Historically speaking, what are we talking about?
Well, you can actually trace these laws all the way back to the colonial period. And that history is super important for understanding why there's so much controversy around them today.
Okay, I'm all ears.
So like way back in 1793, there was this thing called Regulation XD2. And basically it gave these magistrates a lot of power to detain people or even force them into labor just based on suspicion.
Wow, hold on. So they could just lock someone up or make them work without even proving they did anything wrong.
That's basically it. And it really shows you how the system back then was all about control.
That's just wild. And then, of course, it got even worse with that whole Criminal Tribes Act thing, right? The one from 1871.
Yeah, the infamous CTA. And that was a whole other level of messed up. This law actually labeled entire communities as criminal by birth.
Like, seriously, just because of who they were, not what they did.
That's right. It was all about their identity, not their individual actions. And by 1924, they had extended this act across all of colonial India, so you can imagine the impact that had.
It's hard to even fathom that kind of thinking. But luckily, things changed after independence, right? Like, they got rid of that horrible act.
They did, thankfully. In 1952, they repealed the CTA based on this report from the Criminal Tribes Inquiry Committee, and they officially denotified those communities, so that was a huge step in the right direction.
You'd think that would be the end of it, but it seems like the legacy of that act kind of lingered, didn't it?
Yeah, the Hindu article really emphasizes this point. You see, after the CTA was gone, a lot of states started coming up with these new habitual offender acts. And while these new laws were supposed to be about individual behavior, the problem is they often ended up targeting the same communities that had been labeled criminal tribes before.
So it's like they just swapped out the name, but the underlying discrimination was still there.
Exactly. The labels changed, but the impact on these communities remained a huge issue. And what's really interesting is that the Supreme Court has actually spoken out about this very connection.
Really? What did they say?
So last year in October 2024, the Supreme Court was looking at this issue of caste-based discrimination in prisons. And they specifically talked about how labeling communities as criminal tribes back then is connected to how these habitual offender laws are being used today.
That's a pretty big deal, right? The highest court in the country basically saying there's a link between these historical injustices and what's happening now.
It is, and they didn't just stop at pointing it out. They actually urged the states to seriously review their habitual offender laws, especially in cases where it seems like they're being used to profile entire communities.
So they're basically saying, hey, states, you need to take a close look at this and make sure you're not repeating the mistakes of the past.
Exactly, and for anyone studying for the UPSC, this kind of judicial intervention is really important to understand. It shows you how the courts are actively trying to address these issues of historical injustice and protect people's rights.
Absolutely. So, okay, let's get into the specifics here. When someone is labeled a habitual offender,
Yeah.
what kind of things are you talking about? Like, what are the offenses?
Well, the Hindu article gives some examples, and they're honestly pretty eye-opening.
Like what?
Well, they mention things like being a thug or belonging to a gang of dacoits.
Okay, those sound pretty serious.
They do, but then they also mention things like living on the earnings of prostitution and even various forms of lurking.
Lurking, like, what does that even mean?
Right, that's exactly the problem. These
Mm.
categories are often so vague and open to interpretation.
Yeah, one person's lurking could be another person's just, standing around waiting for a friend.
Exactly, and that's where the potential for misuse comes in. And it's not just the vague definitions. The Hindu article also talks about how they still keep these registers of habitual offenders.
Oh, wow. So it's like they're constantly being tracked and monitored even after they've served their time.
That's the concern. And it really does echo that whole colonial idea of keeping tabs on certain communities.
And it's not just a theoretical thing, right? Like, the Hindu gave a specific example of this happening.
They did. They mentioned how in Rajasthan, the prison manuals actually connect being a habitual offender directly to those denotified communities. So it's like that stigma from the past is literally written into their system.
That's pretty disturbing. So basically, even though these communities were officially denotified, they're still dealing with the consequences of that old label.
Exactly. And what's important to understand is that this kind of marginalization can become a cycle. These communities often face more police scrutiny, they're often excluded from opportunities, and that can lead to more interactions with the justice system.
So it's like a self-fulfilling prophecy almost.
In a way, yeah. And the Hindu also talked about how this issue has been brought to light by activists over the years.
Right, they mentioned that tragic case of Bhutan Sabar back in 1998.
Yeah, his death in police custody was a real turning point. It sparked outrage and led to the formation of that group, DNT-RAG, the Denotified and Nomadic Tribes Rights Action Group.
I've heard of them. They've been doing some amazing work advocating for the rights of these communities.
Absolutely. And then you have people like Mahasweta Devi and GN Devi, who really brought these injustices to light through their writing and activism.
Yeah, their work was crucial in getting people to pay attention to what was happening.
And it's not just been ignored at the national level either. The Hindu article mentions how the National Human Rights Commission, the NHRC, got involved, and even the UN Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination called for India to repeal these laws.
Wow, so this has been on the radar of international organizations as well. That's pretty significant.
It is, and this is something that hasn't been studied. The Hindu mentions those reports by the B.S. Ranka Commission and the Zaxa Committee.
Yeah, I was going to ask about those. What did they have to say about all of this?
Both of those commissions really dug deep into this issue, and they basically confirmed what activists had been saying all along. They found that even decades after these communities were denotified, that stigma of criminality was still attached to them.
And that stigma is often reinforced by these habitual offender laws, right? It's like they're constantly being reminded of this label.
Exactly. And for anyone preparing for the UPSC, understanding the findings of these commissions is really important. They provide a lot of insight into the challenges of social justice in India.
Okay, so we've talked about the history, the controversies, the impact. Now, what about the current situation? Like, what's going on with these laws in different states?
Well, according to the Hindu, it really varies from state to state.
Meaning?
Well, because like Punjab and Odisha, for example, they haven't really been using these laws much lately.
So maybe they're moving away from this approach.
Possibly. And then you have Andhra Pradesh, where they say they don't have anyone in jail right now, specifically because of these laws.
Okay, so that sounds somewhat promising.
Yeah, it could be a sign that some states are starting to take a more rights-based approach.
Let's hope so.
Yeah.
But what about the states that are still using these laws?
Well, Gujarat and Goa, for example, they're in favor of keeping these laws. They say they're not being used to specifically target those DNT communities, but that seems to go against what the Supreme Court and those human rights groups are saying.
That's a pretty big disconnect, right?
It is. And then you have Uttar Pradesh, where they've kind of incorporated those habitual offender provisions into their Gundas Act.
So it's like they changed the name, but is it really any different? That's a question for our UPSC folks out there to think about.
Absolutely. And then you have Delhi, which seems to be using these laws more than anyone else.
Really? How so?
According to the National Crime Records Bureau data from 2022, something like 21.5% of convicts in Delhi were labeled as habitual offenders. That's the highest rate in the whole country.
Wow. So clearly these laws are still very much in play in some parts of India.
They are. And that brings us back to the big question, why are so many people calling for these laws to be repealed?
Yeah, like what are the main arguments against them?
Well, first of all, as we've been talking about, these laws are seen as carrying forward that old colonial stigma against certain
And
communities.
it's like they're stuck with that label no matter what.
Right, and that leads to discrimination and marginalization. And then there's the concern that these laws are being used to unfairly target certain communities for police surveillance and harassment.
It's like they're always under suspicion even if they haven't done anything wrong.
Exactly. And then you have the constitutional and human rights arguments.
Okay, explain those.
Well, basically, these laws are seen as potentially violating fundamental rights, like Article 14, which guarantees equality before the law, and Article 19, which is about freedom of movement.
So by treating certain communities differently based on their past, they're essentially denying them equal rights.
That's the argument. And it goes against the whole idea of a fair and just legal system. And the Hindu article also points out that these laws go against India's commitments under international human rights law, the ones about ending racial and caste-based discrimination.
So it's not just a domestic issue. It's something that reflects on India's reputation on the global stage.
And for anyone preparing for the UPSC, these links between national and international law are really important to understand.
Absolutely. So to wrap things up, I think the big takeaway here is that these habitual offender laws create this tension, right?
Yeah.
Between the state's desire to control crime and the rights of these vulnerable communities who are often unfairly targeted.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. And for our UPSC listeners, this issue really highlights how important it is to understand the history behind our laws and how that history can still impact us today.
It's easy to just skim over a headline, but you really have to dig deeper to see the whole picture. And for anyone studying for the UPSC, this is a perfect example of a topic that could come up in your exams.
Absolutely. And it's about more than just exams. It's about understanding how our society works, how our legal system functions, and how we can create a more just and equitable world.
It really makes you think about how laws, even those that seem well-intentioned, can have unintended consequences and can perpetuate inequalities.
It's a reminder to always be critical, always ask questions, and always fight for justice.
So well said. And if you found this deep dive helpful for your UPSC prep or just for understanding this complex issue, please like, subscribe, and leave a comment with any questions you might have.
We're always looking for topics that matter to you.
Absolutely. And just a reminder, our discussion today was based on that excellent reporting from the Hindu. Thanks for joining us.